What month is it again? My sense of time still hasn't recovered since 2020. March, huh? Who wants to talk about a horror game? Faith is one of those games that, by all accounts, should not have the major following it has garnered in the 6.5 years since its release. Another indie development company that has had a whole one success before in Dusk, and that was a freaking first-person shooter. And now they're trying to tap into the sweet, sweet horror goldmine that YouTube refuses to let fall off. It's a theme that any lesser developer would have fumbled completely. But New Blood Interactive are different. They made Ultra Kill a few years after this. It's clear in hindsight that this team is talented and unhinged enough to make something truly stand out. And Faith, the Unholy Trinity, very much falls into this. Countless people have praised this game for its horror elements, its tightly written and emotional story, and that feeling of helplessness that your limited moveset gives you. But the most iconic part of this game that has stayed in the minds of many is the wild artistic choices that have been made here. You've probably seen at least one meme in this art style. It's unlike anything else that gaming has really seen before. So, how effective is it in context of a religious horror game? Let's take a look. Before we look at the game itself, we need to talk about just how the hell they made pixels look like that. It almost looks impossible, right? Pixel art is defined by being completely detached from making things look realistic for the most part, instead choosing to adhere to strict limitations that allow shapes and objects to be portrayed in stylized and unique ways, creating vibrant and visually diverse styles that can appeal to us in so many different ways. But this... it's almost the antithesis of what people expect pixel art to be, and even past that, it looks utterly painstaking to make. So, how is it done? Well, as I'm sure at least a few of you have heard of, this game heavily utilises a technique called rotoscoping for the majority of its complex animation, which is an animation practice almost as old as the medium of digital art itself. Rotoscoping is the practice of taking a piece of live action footage, such as a person dancing or walking, and tracing over it frame by frame to capture the exact real life movements of a person in an animated way, creating this smooth and lifelike movement we see in Faith. This practice can be used to varying levels, with some people choosing to take certain keyframes of a live action movement to then animate the parts in between, whereas others took every last frame of a real life movement and placed it onto an animated character, a process that I imagine is hell on earth. And that isn't even considering the fact that we have a ton of technology to speed up the process nowadays, such as onion skinning programs that allow animators to see previous frames to get a better idea of how to draw the next one. Back when it was first used around the 1910s, they had this massive machine that would simply project the live action video onto a canvas, where they would have to hard animate every single frame. It was exhausting to do in large doses. Yet, many studios such as Fleischer Studios, owned by the creator of the rotoscope machine, Max Fleischer, use it to great effect in the oldest iconic cartoons such as Popeye, and Disney eventually got their hands on this technology after Fleischer's copyright patent expired, and used it for the first ever fully feature-length animated film, Snow White, in 1937. After the miraculous success of Snow White from Disney, rotoscoping became a staple of this period's animation, from both Fleischer himself as he continued to animate with it until the early 1940s, with his last work being this version of Superman, but with Disney and other animation studios as well for the time, with these smooth dance sequences being seen all over the place. Hell, even the Beatles would use this for a version of the Yellow Submarine. That's how ever present it was. The technique would keep up its popularity until the technology in animation simply evolved past it, as things like computers started to pop up, and by roughly the turn of the millennia, it had largely died off, with Fantasia being arguably the last major use of it within the animation world, at least in a major sense. But you may be wondering, Sparky, this is a great history lesson of animation, but I came here to talk about video games. So what games use rotoscoping at all? I mean, there's Shaq Fu, is that enough for you? Yeah, well, rotoscoping was used a ton across media. The rise of video games largely came after the true height of its popularity, and as a result, not many high-profile video games use rotoscoping that much, instead using to use traditional pixel art that originated in the arcades. However, the world of fighting games would be a notable exception to this, as not only did Street Fighter 3 use rotoscoping for this character, Elena, to capture her capoeira fighting style accurately as these movements are quite complex, but the early entries of Mortal Kombat used rotoscoping a ton to capture the punches and kicks of real life and put them into the game, creating that brutal yet realistic violence that made this game so infamous, yet iconic. Ever since this time period, rotoscoped animation has become a novelty, a showing of a bygone era that is used simply for a gimmick or a change of pace now. Like, when you enter Simpsons couch gag territory, that's when you know you're past your prime. Yes, I know the irony of a pixel art guy saying that, at least my art form is still used in video games, okay? So, we have a functionally outdated animation style that hasn't been relevant in over 20 years, and an indie horror game full of horrible demons about a priest that has been traumatized by his failures and is now haunted by the demon he failed to stop in his past. How on earth have these game developers managed to take both of these complex and niche subjects and combine them into one of the most unique, engaging and intriguing horror games that has come out recently? Well, New Blood found a way to do this, so I think it's time to start looking at the game proper and how they use pixel art to turn these ideas into reality, using rotoscoping and the rest. Real quick before we get into the main draw of this game's art, the cutscenes, we have an actual game to look at here. Big shock, I know. Now, it's obvious that the actual gameplay has a pretty minimalistic art style, as this game takes a lot of notes from the Atari era of gaming back in the early 80s, before that whole gaming crash that every Mario Bros history video goes on about. This influence can be seen across every single aspect of this game's aesthetic, from the voice acting, having this robotic tone to it, to of course the pixel art, which is extremely basic. The majority of the human characters are functionally stick figures with at most 2 colours, one for the body and one for any accessories such as the priest collar, of John Ward, our protagonist. The walking animations for most of these people are literally just 2 frames, all of this showing that the entire art direction of the non-cutscene parts of this game is meant to be as basic as possible. So why is that? Well, in my opinion, I believe that it is an effective way of stripping back any bells and whistles that may distract the player from the sheer fear and unease that this game aims to bring forward, as making these designs too complex during gameplay would potentially make the most tense segments of this game more cluttered and harder to focus on. By making the in-game sprites so simple, it allows players to entirely zone in on the world and their surroundings, making them more paranoid as a result, as even a single clump of pixels could spell your death. Also, the heavy contrast that is made between the lifelike animation of the cutscenes and the very basic and archaic animation and pixel art of the gameplay serves to make this game's most impactful moments hit that much harder, as being thrown from a scene that as basic as this to a moment of detailed terror like this is utterly harrowing for players. While the creature may look like this when you're playing the game, you know what you're really up against, and that almost forbidden-like knowledge is hugely effective at keeping players on edge across the entire game. Okay, that's enough talking about glorified stick figures. We'll leave them to their oddly well animated fight scenes. Let's get into the real meat of these pixels, the good old rotoscoped animations. I think it's best to start with the human, or at least humanoid characters, as they are way less complicated to look at and give us an easier look into how rotoscoping has been used here. So let's start by taking a look at our main character, John Ward. Immediately, we can see that a large amount of these cutscene animations are there to highlight the most horrific moments of the game, from John getting possessed by demons, to the many ways this poor guy can get killed in this game, and the animation work makes them so much more harrowing. The scenes being traced from real-life movements make them feel so much more realistic and personal to us. Many people who play horror games, or even just games with graphic or violent themes, tend to have become desensitized to violent imagery because, in many cases, it's presented in a very exaggerated or abstract way that makes it easy to detach from reality, making its impact pretty mild in the grand scheme of things. In Faith, however, this use of rotoscoping allows these movements to feel way more real than nearly any other game, as the movements are nearly exactly how anyone would react to these situations. Take this scene for example, where John awakens from a nightmare of seeing one of the most powerful demons in the game, the Unspeakable. The quick transition from this close-up of his face to him gasping for air as he gets up feels so much more real and personal than if it was animated normally, really allowing the players to connect themselves with John in this moment, and the awful experience he's going through. However, John isn't the only human in the game, so let's analyse one more before we get into the more sinister beings of this game. Let's turn our attention to the antithesis of the priest John, Gary, the leader of the cults you fight against throughout this game. The first and most obvious difference is within the colour, with Gary being bathed in a hellish red, which directly contrasts with the blue of John, concisely painting Gary as the complete opposite of the righteous and determined nature of John, instead showing him as this master manipulator and the monster he truly is. This is further seen with just how messy and chaotic his facial expressions become as the conversation you have with him progresses, turning him from a relatively normal looking person with a clear beard and bald head invisible, to a twisted and gory being that shows his true demonic origins. This is further shown in the scene where he gets shot by Father Garcia, with his face now fully contorted to have inhumanly placed teeth poking out from under his hood, as well as his movements just looking slightly off, as if his humanity and mind have now crumbled into primal demonic rage. And with that, I think it's time to get into the most enticing use of rotoscoping in this game, the demons. The first demon you encounter, and one of the best showings of just how distorted the rotoscoping can get in this game, is the Chupacabra, or Michael Davies as we'll refer to him from now on. And his movements are completely inhuman, crawling along the floor like a mutant spider as it stalks you through the forest. This is an example of the animation not being entirely based around the rotoscope video, as its body proportions have been altered to be far more sickly and thin than any regular human should be. And this warping of the human form makes these demons seem very unnerving as a result. It's the more subtle design that really makes the horrific aspects of Michael's design so apparent, as, while yes, the more heavily detailed demons, like Malthus later in the game, are scary and disturbing in their own right, this guy reminds you enough of a regular human to really show how horrible his transformation truly is, and the suffering he has endured while being possessed, making his design far more effective in my opinion. The real kicker in my opinion, though, is his pause screen animation, where he ambushes the screen and writhes in pain when the player attempts to pause the game while he's chasing you, punishing the player for trying to escape. This goddamn animation is so good. Not only is the running towards the screen perfectly terrifying for players, as it's one of the only times we see him walk on two legs, making him look larger and more dangerous as a result, but the run is just so off-looking, and that's what makes it so effective in a horror sense. Yes, the rotoscoping means that a human could make these kinds of movements, but that mixed with the horrific face and form of Michael makes it so horrible to be met with, especially on the pause screen where you thought you were safe. Moments like this are what define Faith's animation style as so amazing. This ability to take a human's movements and distort them subtly yet effectively makes players truly realise how horrific these possessions are, overall making the monsters of this game insanely effective. Of course, there are a ton of major and minor demons within this game, some of which only existing during the gameplay, such as the centipede and basement demons, both of which I'm sure would have horrific designs if we did get any cutscenes with them, but unfortunately have not been given that treatment. Still, many of these minor demons still have some appeal to them, because I imagine it would be a real challenge to differentiate many of these guys when working with such a basic art style. But the artists have managed to make these little alterations to all of them, to make them all at least distinguishable from each other, making every unique chase that much more special and horrible as well. Then there are some more demons who have had rotoscoping applied to them, such as the thrall in the candy tunnel that stabs John if caught, a visceral and panic-inducing cutscene that really highlights the brutality of this death, to the peekaboo demon, which slowly creeps up on the player when they're standing still, helpless and praying that the demon doesn't attack them. It's a bone-chilling sequence, and the animation in the cutscene does it full justice, with the piercing eye in particular being horrifying as it's so close to the camera, almost as if the demon is staring through the game and the player themselves. Then we get to the final major antagonist of the game, who is slightly different from anything else in this game, Miriam Bell, a character shrouded in mystery more than arguably any other in the game, as well as the original leader of the cult you fight in the game, and the reason Gary exists at all. You would think that such an important character would have a wildly intimidating figure, right? But you couldn't be more wrong. Instead, these animations attempt to capture the feeling of being lured into a full sense of security, with Miriam being portrayed as this old, feeble nun to start off with, but slowly morphing into a demonic and violent creature. This is first seen in the paintings that you see of her, as her portrait begins as just a normal picture, but it slowly dissolves and warps until it becomes a monster, all while a strange, seemingly demonic figure creeps up behind her, and that is the exact feeling that her entire character is trying to invoke. A seemingly innocent, or at least unassuming old woman, who ends up being this rotten, disfigured and purely evil beast. And that is exactly why the art of this game is so stellar at creating the atmosphere of horror it's trying to go for. Whether it's aiming to be directly threatening and scary by portraying demons as grotesque, misshapen monsters that move completely wrong, or if it's trying to make the player fester and stew in their fear by having the demons slowly walk towards them, while writhing in pain or anticipation almost, to even having a seemingly harmless woman suddenly spring out as a demon. This game's pixel art has the ability to grip the player into its atmosphere perfectly in so many ways, and the unique use of rotoscoping helps in making all of these feelings still feel grounded in reality, to keep players invested and intrigued at the events unfolding around them, creating an overall masterstroke in the indie horror presentation. Horror is one of those genres in gaming that is open to so much creativity and interpretation, as there are so many different ways to make people feel scared and unnerved. And while many modern horror games are stuck in this mascot horror hellscape of making cheap, lazy, and overly marketable visions, Faith is a glowing example of just how unique and artistically brilliant horror can really be, and how so many seemingly outrageous and confusing ideas can come together to make something truly special. Even if you're like me and aren't a massive fan of horror games, for whatever reason, the sheer variety of ways that this game tries to portray its dark, disturbing themes is so awesome to see. And I hope more creators can move forward with this same desire to make something truly unique and artistically special. So, with all of that said, make sure to exercise that subscribe button, and as always, I'll see you when I see you. Bye!